We're talking today with Mr. Basil Morris of Kalamazoo, Michigan. The interviewer is James Smither of the Grand Valley State University Veterans History Project. Now, Mr. Morris, can you begin with some background on yourself? Where and when were you born, for instance?
Yes, I was born June 14, 1922 in Allegan County, Michigan. I was the 8th of 13 children in my family. We lived on farms throughout my lifetime, and my earlier brothers and sister who had gone to school stopped at the 8th grade level, and I thought when I reached the 8th grade level I was through.
Mm-hmm.
So for a couple of years I worked on farms, and apparently I had done very well in the country schools because the neighbors convinced my parents to somehow arrange for me to go to high school,
Mm-hmm.
which they did. They left the farm and went into the city of Otsego, Michigan.
Okay, and by city, how large was Otsego in those days?
At that time it was about 1,200 people.
But they had a high school.
Yes, they had a high school, and there were 66 students in my graduating class in 1941.
All right.
And during high school, I became, as we would say today, best friends with Bill Sullivan, and he and I had most of the high school offices and student council offices. In other words, we actually, put it bluntly, we were the leaders in the
Right.
school. And then one day, shortly after Pearl Harbor, there was an ad in the Kalamazoo Gazette that said the Air Corps recruiters would be in Kalamazoo on a certain date, at a certain time, at a certain place. So Bill Sullivan and I decided we'd go over and see if we could pass those tests.
Okay. Now I want to stop you right there. Let's back up a little bit. You graduate from high school in the spring of 41,
Right.
so before Pearl Harbor. Did you go back to farm work at that point, or what were you going to do?
No. Actually, at that time, my older brother, was very executive in a local paper company, and he got me a job there where I could work until I could go into business school, which was my intention.
Okay.
And so I worked nights there, cleaning up the wax and so forth that they spilled on the floor and like that. And then I enrolled in Parsons Business School, which is now extinct.
Mm-hmm.
And had one semester, which ended about the time of Pearl Harbor.
Right. Now, how did you hear about Pearl Harbor?
Oh, that was another story, really. It was Sunday, of course, as everybody knows, and we heard it on the radio. But my first wife and I were members of the Sunday school group that went to church that evening, as usual. And the minister there, Dr. Percy Graham, was a little short Canadian-born man. And he had a habit of picking his nails and gritting his teeth when he was really, really intent. And so he brought his table radio to the meeting, and he sat there just glued to that radio all through our meeting and picking his fingers. And then we went back to our homes, and of course we were very well informed about what was going on by that time.
Right.
And that was the first time I ever had an experience of a newspaper extra, with the cars driving up and down the streets and boys on the running board, extra, read all about it, Japanese attack Pearl Harbor.
Okay. And was this in Kalamazoo? Or?
That was in Otsego.
That's still Otsego. Okay.
Yes, right.
So even in a town that small, they're selling the papers out in the street like that.
Right.
Okay.
Right. So we were pretty well informed by that time.
All right. Now, before this time, back when you were still in school, were you paying attention to the events in the world and the news from Europe, or were you just focused on things at home?
We were pretty well focused on things at home.
Okay. So it was kind of a surprise then, really, when this hits.
Yes. Oh, big surprise.
All right. Now, in this, you didn't enlist right away. You didn't immediately go and sign up. Did you just think about it for a while, and then your friend kind of came up with the idea, or?
No, it was the first time this ad came up was in January.
Okay, so that is that early.
Yes,
Yeah.
it was about mid-January.
Right.
So we came over to Kalamazoo and took and passed the test.
Okay.
Now, Bill stayed out, and he was in college at that time, and he stayed out a while. And he became a naval flight officer and was retired with the rank of captain. And he's gone now due to Lou Gehrig's disease, but I went on into the Air Force from
Okay.
there.
So where did they send you for your basic training?
Most of my training was in California.
Okay.
I started in Santa Ana, California, and the cadet program, and went from there. Well, we had to make choices. What did we want to be? A navigator, a pilot, a bombardier? And I, interestingly, when I went in, there was a trainload of us that met in Detroit, a trainload, and went all the way to Santa Ana, California, in that old freight, or almost freight train, cars that had been taken out of service and were put back in service. And you lift the windows up to get some air in, and there's no air conditioning or anything like that. And so, as I said, I started in Santa Ana. We had to make a choice. And en route, I had learned that a lot of the men were college graduates and are in college, and here I am, one semester of business school. I thought, I just might be in over my head here. I don't want to fail. So I put down I wanted to be a mechanic. And a day or two, a couple of days later, I got a call from a psychologist. He talked to me a little bit, and he assured me that I had done well on the tests and that I would probably be a navigator. He said I'd probably be a navigator. So when the orders came out, I was a pilot. And so I went through the pilot ground school there at Santa Ana. And at that time, a lot of the facilities weren't built and so forth. And when my graduation came, there was no place to send us right then for pilot training.
Okay. Now, what did the ground school consist of? What were you learning there?
There were a lot of college, it was college level, including, well, of course, engines and their design, and a lot of very complicated formula and how the engines perform, meteorology. We had some history, and we had the Morse code classes, and and I don't recall some of the others right now, but it was hard work.
Okay. Did they give you physical training? Were you marching and drilling?
Were we doing great athletic things on, gymnastics, and climbing the big high walls, and running, and it was tough. And well, I passed it.
Okay. Well, were you in pretty good shape when you went in, or?
Oh yes, because I was a farm boy, you
Yeah.
know, and farm boys get pretty good workouts, and so that was no problem.
Now, did they put much of an influence on discipline and following orders?
Oh, indeed. But by the time I got in, they had stopped hazing. Prior to that, the cadets had to eat in squares. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but that's if you have food on your plate, you get your food, go up here, up here, down here, that type of thing. And another, just a little bit of hazing, regardless of whether it was supposed to be done or not. But they had relaxed enough the desire to get us through and get us out of there. They had relaxed enough that there wasn't much monkey work.
Okay. So they got you through and finished that, but then they didn't have anywhere to send you?
That's right, for a week. So they sent us up to Merced, California, and let us there. We learned to taxi the B-13, which was the one we would later fly in.
Mm-hmm.
That was the biggest thing we learned, but other than that, it was just passing time until they sent us to Dos Palos, California, to a privately owned school. They flew the Ryan P-22s.
And what kind of plane was that?
That was a low-wing, open cockpit, little small plane that you had to crank with a propeller. And I had never been in a plane before. So that first ride, which was strictly a ride with the instructor doing all of the flying, such a feeling when you realize I'm up in the air here, down there is the ground, and yet there's really no feeling. It's just, I felt like maybe a spider web was up above me and holding me up. And but I had a very good instructor there. The ground school again was quite demanding. But it was a very nice school, privately built, and nice dorms that we worked in small groups, and a nice hangar with facilities and so on. And my instructor was a real nice guy. Now, most men soloed after 7 hours of instruction. I soloed after 13 hours of instruction. Again, as I look at it now, I was lacking confidence. I just thought, my gosh, this can't be me. But the instructor was very good. He kept working with me, and he got me through. And while I was there, before I went into the service even, I was dating my later-to-be wife, a high school classmate. And I decided one day I called her up to see if she would marry me. And she agreed. She was working for her father then. He was the freight agent and Western Union operator in that little station in Otsego. And we agreed that we would get married after I graduated from my primary school. I would get a pass, and she would come to California on the train, of course, and I would meet her there, and then we would arrange to get married. And so she did come. My train was late getting in. It was like a cattle train. Like they had a passenger car, and the rest of them were cattle cars. And that was a long, long ride from Dos Palos to Los Angeles, and it was late. And I could tell she had been crying when I got there, and others had been offering her help. What could they do for her, and so forth. And one of them even suggested maybe I had stood her up. So that made her real happy, of course. And, well, I finally got there. Then we took a cab. We were going to go to a hotel and make our plans. And on the way, we mentioned to the driver what our situation was. And he said, well, in California, you have to have a blood test, and it takes 3 days to get it. Well, I was on a 3-day pass with all these big plans. So what do? Well, we decided then that we would take the train to Las Vegas overnight, get there the next morning, be married, get back on the train and come back and go to my next camp, which is what we did in Las Vegas. And it was kind of interesting because I had to have permission to be married. And my mother had written a note of permission. And my wife never let me forget that she didn't have to have permission.
Why did you need permission?
Because I was under 21.
Ah.
She was 18, and that was okay for girls. So I handed the clerk my permission from my mommy, and she gave us the license, $2, and then she directed us downstairs to the judge's office. And well, we were there. We waited till 8 o'clock to go in on that morning, and the judge wasn't in yet. But eventually he got there, and he came in, and we introduced ourselves and told him what we were doing. And so, you want to get married? And then he called out, "Hey, Mike, you want to witness a wedding?" And later he said, "Hey, Mary, do you want to witness a wedding?" And of course they both said yes, and in they came. So they stood up with us before the judge, and he married us. And I think we had to give, or we did give each of the witnesses $2. And we were married. And that was that. And we killed time until about 4 o'clock in the afternoon when we could get on the train to go back to Los Angeles. And we got in there and into the train. And of course it was jam-packed with military people. And we were on an old car that had been re-rigged again. And it had a painted floor, a newly painted floor. And the paint hadn't even dried, really. So we ended up with orange shoes and so forth. And we were sitting right up in the front where people came in the car. They had to walk in over our feet and go back to their seats. And later in the evening, I got the conductor and I explained my situation. And I said, "Now, we've just been married. And isn't there a place we can be more comfortable on this train?" And he said, "Well, car back there, you can go look at it." But he says, "I don't know that it'll do you much good." So we went back to that car, and it was a nice modern car by our standards. And I found a woman alone in one seat and a young lady alone in another seat, and they were sleeping. But I got the young lady to go up and take the seat with Ed, and then we got this nice seat. Rode overnight, got back to LA, jumped on a bus that took us to my next assignment, which was back to Merced for my basic flight training. And the people were very nice, very kind and thoughtful and generous about renting rooms in their homes for wives and like that. And so my wife got a room that she shared with another cadet's wife, and it worked out really well. And if we got weekend passes, we would switch times. One time, this couple would go to the motel, and we would have the room, and then next time, the other way around. And so here we go again. I got into basic training, which is the B-13, a much more powerful plane and so forth. And in my story, I have a record that I was able to get from my flight book that I kept, that for some miracle got retained, wasn't thrown away. I still have it. And but I started having trouble. Couldn't meet what the expectations. So I had at least 5 different instructors that were trying to pull me out of it and to get me to be acceptable. Mm-hmm. And finally, my instructor was the stage commander. But again, they were all considerate and kind, and every few hours I'd have a flight check with somebody. Now, I never was told that I was failing, never anything like that, but I just knew that most people had one instructor, they flew, they soloed, and went on. I can't even tell you how many hours I had when they finally let me solo, and I soloed successfully. And most people, many people would have been discharged in a situation like that and sent back to become Army, what do we call them, ground?
Yeah, infantry.
Yeah, they'd be private in the Army. For some reason, they didn't do that. And they brought me on, and I soloed and graduated and went on to multi-engine flight. And that was my downfall. On my solo flight there, I wrecked the airplane. I never got it off the ground. It was a big runway there. Oh, very big, at Roswell, New Mexico.
And what kind of plane were you in?
It was a twin engine, we called it a flying cheese box. I can't remember the brand, but it's in my records.
It was a twin engine bomber trainer or transport or?
Well, it was
just a twin engine plane.
Just a twin engine plane, flight pilot trainer.
Right.
That's what it was made for. And so on my solo flight, another cadet was my co-pilot, and when we got going, I was to tell him when to lock the tail wheel. So we did all of the procedures and got headed down the strip to take off. And he said, "You want me to lock the tail wheel?" And I said, "No, not yet, not yet." And I was walking the throttles, trying to get those engines both walking. Pretty soon we had a pretty good speed, but we went in a big circle.
Oh.
And the right wheel broke off, and down we went on the wing, and the props were scraping cement. And out came the fire trucks and the ambulance, and I said, "I'm through. I don't want any more of this." And they took us to the hospital, checked our blood pressure and all that stuff. And I said again, "No, I don't want any more to do with flight." And I think it might have been 2 days later, I'm not sure of this, that I went before the board, which was all Air Force officers, making their hearing of this event. And I told them, "I'm through with flight training. I don't want any more of it." So they didn't wash me out. They sent me back to Santa Ana to start over again and do something else. And so I came out of Bombardier, which happened in Albuquerque, New Mexico, like June 19, 1942. So all of these events had happened, and I'd only been in about 6 months.
Okay, so that really is awfully, that does seem awfully fast.
Yeah.
That many things.
Yeah.
But I guess X number of weeks here and then there and
Yeah.
all in California.
6 weeks.
Yeah.
It was kind of in 6-week terms. And so over again with the ground school. And one of the most interesting things in ground school was that some of the professors, and we had college professors, there was one man from MIT. When we were doing our tests, he'd be at the blackboard writing with both hands and make his word come together where it should. I never forgot that. And but so I graduated then, got my wings in June of 42.
Right. Now, were you training to use the Norden bomb sight? Or?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And how well did it actually work in training?
I had a lot of trouble with it because the gyros would get out of balance, and that was the trick to the Norden, was to keep those gyros in balance. And I really didn't like it very well. I did well on it, but I didn't like the way it operated.
Part of what you were doing with that too is you're actually controlling the plane at a certain point when,
Right.
when that's set.
Right.
Did it help you to have had the pilot training already when you were doing that, or did it not make much difference for that?
No, I think it helped because I realized what it would be like to sit there in a pilot seat and take instructions from that machine. And but in Albuquerque, you know, there's kind of a little mountainous there. And this would be in the heat of the summer. And at one point we had to do, think we called it direct DR bombing. I think that was the name of it, which would mean we could use a bomb site, but it was not, it was only a mechanical thing. And, but you had to put your eye on the site, and you'd end up with a black ring around the eye, because your head would be bobbing up and down with the plane bobbing up and down, and so forth. But I survived that, and got my wings. And all of this time after my wife came out, she was with me. She would go from base to base and always find a reasonable place to live.
Did she ever take a job in those places?
Oh yes. In Albuquerque, she worked in the Montgomery Ward store. And when I was in Santa Ana, she worked in a Hallmark store there. I have a picture of her and two co-workers in the home of one of them, and they were putting price tags on Hallmark cards. Each card, price tag. And then in Merced, she worked packing dried fruit in the gift boxes. And that was the type of thing those wives did to make money and to keep busy.
Right.
So they put up with quite a bit also. But when I got my wings, she had to go home. All wives go home, cannot go to the next base of their parents, of their husband. And so she went home and I went home, or I went to my next assignment, which was Clovis, New Mexico. A good friend of mine, Bob Long, was with me. We went to Clovis for navigation training. They called that DR, direct reckoning, station training to navigate the plane in case the equipment was out or something like that. So we completed that, and then I got a leave to go home, and I think that was 14 days, and then reported back to McCook, Nebraska, and that is where the 454th group was being formed. And they had only skeleton at that time. I think they had 4 crews who had trained to be the seed for this new group that they were forming. And that was where I became a member of the 736 Squadron of the 454th Bomb Group. And at that time there, I met my first pilot, and maybe a couple of crew members. And then it just going on, another day, another crew member would come in, and we just did a lot of flying around and getting used to the big airplane. And
what kind of plane were you in?
that was a B-24. We called it a flying boxcar. And that was quite an experience, I'll say that much. And of course, I trained on the Norden bomb site, so I had a Sperry on this plane, and I liked that. Didn't have to worry about the gyros. And eventually, I got to the point where I knew I was going to go overseas soon, so I made arrangement for my wife to come out for like a weekend or something like that. And in what was the town again? McCook, Nebraska. There were 2 hotels, and I called to see what kind of hotel arrangement we could make for my wife to come out. And I took the highest price room they had. That was $4.25 per night. And so she came in, and for a very short time. And then I was appointed a car commander to make the train trip to Charleston, South Carolina. And so we all gathered down at the station, and my wife was over here and the other wives and so forth, and it was a kind of a, we don't know, what's next, what are we going to do? And eventually I was told to take my men down to car so-and-so, which I did. And it was rainy, it was nasty. And got them on the car, into the car, and I got in, and sort of like the train started.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't even say goodbye to my wife. She didn't even know what happened to me. But that was the way it was. And so we went to Charleston, South Carolina, where I'm looking back now on letters I wrote to my wife. It's a good thing I did, or I wouldn't have known about it. I was beginning to be given more responsibility. And they asked me to train the new pilots and navigators that didn't have the bombardier big background. So I had to set up a training program for these people, which I did, and that went okay. And we did a lot of practice bombing, and
When you were doing practice bombing, over what kind of targets were you doing that?
well, they would be ground targets. They would normally they would be big circles with circular marks at different distances from the center, so we could tell exactly how close or how well we bombed. Mm-hmm. And that was all it was. It wasn't buildings or anything like that. Of course, there was a little building right smack in the center of the target, but this time we were dropping 100-pound bombs with sand in them, but enough explosive so it would explode. And there was also some flour, I guess, because they would make kind of a white explosion, so you could see where the bomb hit. And it used to be interesting because we would fly over the port in Charleston and see all of the welders' torches going as they were building and repairing ships there. It was quite a sight. And then came the time when we were, I remember one time the chief engineer got some brake fluid or something on the wool or the sheepskin of his jacket. And he went up to the flight deck, and we were flying with the captain of the group that time. And he saw that red stuff, so he just put the plane in a dive. He thought this was blood. He was a very, very reflexive person. And anyway, then the time came to go overseas. We had to take the planes first to Mitchell Field in New York for some alteration. I don't know what it was. But we went over as a group. So we had to take all of our tents and everything with us. And our plane was loaded. And in addition to that, we had 4 or 5 passengers. And so we flew by way of Brazil. We went out of Morrison Field in Florida, from Mitchell Field to Morrison Field, and down up to Puerto Rico and Trinidad and down to Natal, Brazil. And there again, we were waiting for a place to park the plane over in West Africa. Mm-hmm. And we waited there at least a week because, again, there was no place to park the plane.
Now, when was this?
This was in December of 43.
Oh, 43 or 42?
42.
Okay, because the landings in North Africa were November of 42.
Yeah.
So was it shortly after the landings and they had to prepare the fields and places for you to go?
Right.
Okay.
In fact, the landing strips then were just metal that was laid on the dirt, and usually not long enough to make a pleasant landing, but you had to be really on the ball. And so it took us a week or so to get from West Africa up to Tunis, where we spent, again, some time waiting.
Okay. Well, then, I was thinking about the chronology of this. To have gotten to Tunis, which doesn't fall until about May of 43. But were you, so then maybe it really was 43 that,
No, it was late. There was still war going on in northern Italy
well, yeah,
when we got there.
well, Italy, but well, there's war going on in Italy until the end of 45. But there's sort of a sequence of events here. We're just trying to fit you into it. I mean, we can probably go up and look up the unit history and sort it out. But basically, November of 42 are the Operation Torch landings in North Africa. That's when they land in Morocco and Algeria. And then in February, there's the Battle of Kasserine. It's not until May that they really get into Tunisia. So that's May of 43. And given the usual length of pilot training and the different sequence of things through these camps, it would make sense to have you arrive there in 43 and then
Well, I remember Tunis was a mess then. The buildings were full
Right.
of bullet holes
Right.
and so forth.
right. But basically, was that the first area where you were based in Africa, or did they have you over in Morocco first?
No, I was based in, my memory fails me, but Dakar.
Okay.
We flew
Senegal.
over to Dakar,
Right.
then went to Marrakesh,
Okay.
and then I guess we went from Marrakesh to Tunis.
Okay. But were you based
That would have
based
been
in?
January of 43.
But we weren't in Tunis in January of 43. We just weren't there. I mean, the Germans were still there.
Well, that's what, December of 42. January 43, we flew from Tunis to our base in Italy.
No, that's got to be 44. The dates are what they are.
You must be right. Yeah, you're right. You're right. I got my dates
Yeah.
all
Well,
screwed up.
that's really actually you just slip a year one place, which is easy enough to have happen. We get that all the time.
Because we flew into Italy in January of 44. And that field, the dirt was still wet.
Right.
It was carved out of a nobleman's farm. And dirt runways, dirt revetments to park the plane, and it was in that, we had no building. There were two buildings there. One was a wine cellar, and the other was stable.
And what was the place called?
Well, we called it, it was just the Sherignola. But I don't have a name for the nobleman.
No, just the town. That was it.
Yeah.
So we can locate that.
Yeah.
All right.
And so that was an eye-opener to be there where there were no buildings. We had to pitch tents and make everything, dig a big slit trench for that purpose out on the hill, rain, snow, or sunshine. And it was cold. This is January. And we heated the tents by arranging to drip 100 octane gasoline from a tank outside of the tent through a little tube to drip it on rocks in the center of the tent. And that was the way we heated our tents. That was also the way we burned tents. The way tents exploded and blew the one that was lighting the fire, blew them out of the tent. And it's a wonder we didn't lose people in that way, and as opposed to losing them to the enemy. And but anyway, to get back to what was going on, my pilot was a good pilot, Paul Maddox, long gone, and we were squadron leaders. We led the high right squadron, and first two missions were what we called milk runs, just easy to get the feel of it.
And when were you flying those?
This was in January and February.
Okay, so right there, not very long after you arrived, you're
That's
flying
right,
pretty quickly.
Yeah, right, we started flying very quickly. And in fact, we all each had to dig a trench for our own safety too, to get into in case we had to, because the Germans were just north of us.
Yeah. Did you get artillery fire or air
Nothing.
attack, or
Nothing.
you were just preparing for it, but it didn't happen? Okay.
Fortunately.
All right. Can you describe these first two missions a little bit more?
Well, one was a marshalling yard, and the other one was maybe a port facility, but we never even saw the enemy and flew up and back. In fact, on one of the missions, some of our gunners started shooting at our friendly aircraft that were fighters that were out there. And so came my third mission, and the briefing was always a hard to explain moment, because we all knew that anytime we went out, we might not come back. We didn't dwell on that, we just knew it. So you had a strange feeling. Early in the morning, it's dark, you go into the stable, and there the intelligence people and the operations officer and the meteorologist giving us all the information we need about all conditions and about the target. And so after that was over, then of course I had to go out and watch the loading of the bombs and be sure all of that was right, and then grab a little breakfast and get ready for the mission. The mission was to bomb an aircraft assembly plant at Graz, Austria. We got off safely, but there was a lot of concern about people that were putting bombs in the wheel wells of our planes, so that when you go off and the wheels come up, they set off the bomb. We lost some that way.
There were people doing that? Was that intentionally to sabotage the planes, or
Yeah.
who would be doing that?
Enemy.
Okay.
Sometimes you wonder, is it our own people? And I'll tell you more about that. And again, the runway was not good, but the plane, when you are ready for a mission, it's full of gasoline, it's full of bombs, it's full of crew, and you've got to have a good pilot to get you safely off the ground in those conditions. Some of them didn't make it. And that's war. But on this day that we went to Austria, we took off, and you know, it's a tough job to get 26 airplanes into formation when they're all taking off one after the other, and they're all heavily loaded, and they're circling and circling. But we made it, and then headed, and of course we went up the Adriatic Sea, because then there's no aircraft guns out there, and it's the straight way to go anyway. And as we got overland, pretty quiet, and then eventually we could see puffs out there, which was the anti-aircraft, and once in a while it rocked the plane a little bit, but of course, I was up in the nose of the airplane on my knees and so forth. But I was gunnery officer also, and so we just kept going toward our IP. You know what IP is, don't you? Initial point. To where we say, okay, from here on now we take our heading to the target.
Right.
And the flak just got worse and worse.
Now, had you flown over the Alps at this point? So were you up in the mountains now?
Yeah, a little bit.
Okay.
Not because we were only bombing at about 22,000, something like that. And but the flak got a little worse. But anyway, we reached our IP and started for the target. Thallerholst aerodrome, and I had never a better fix on a target than I had then. My crosshairs were just staying on the target, and the plane was going, and I thought, boy, it just can't be better than this. And the way we operated, as you might have heard before, is we don't open our Bombay doors until the lead plane of the group opens his Bombay doors. So I'm all ready, and I sit here with my finger on the toggle switch that would open my Bombay doors, watching this plane up here. He never opened his Bombay doors. So I didn't open mine, of course. Orders are orders. We just kept going. And I thought, what the hell's happening? Why didn't we could see the target very well? So we kept going north, and we kept going north, and then I saw some little specks up here, little black specks up in the sky. And I got on the radio and I said to the crew, I said, I think they're going to come at us. They're up at 11 o'clock. And get your guns ready, give them test shots if you think best, and I'll keep you informed. And it wasn't very long before we met them. They were coming in at 1 o'clock, and our gunners weren't very good. They hadn't had enough practice. I don't know whether they did much damage to them or not, but they were twin-engine fighters, and they were vicious. Oh, Lordy, were they vicious. They were like bumblebees attacking you. And, but again, I'm up here, at this point, now, I'm standing up on the nose with my head up in the bubble to tell them where the planes are and so forth, to keep them informed. And then it was on the second pass, though, that a German bullet or whatever it was went into our nose turret. And the nose turret was turned like this to make the fighters. And they hit that mechanism, and the thing was decommissioned. And out there is the nose gunner sitting out there. And I was able, hadn't ever been taught anything about this, but I was able to find a manual mechanism so I could crank the thing and get him out of there. And he just died last month. It kept going, and until we had 2 engines of fire, both throwing flames back, and one engine was running wild, out of control. It couldn't do anything with it, and one running normally. So obviously we couldn't keep up with the group. So we left the group eventually, went down and started left. And we were hoping that we might make Switzerland, and we didn't. Wasn't too long before we got the bailout order, and by that time there was gasoline running inside of the plane, and the engines burning and so forth.
And you still had your bombs then too, didn't you?
Still had the bombs. So I salvoed the bombs. And I wondered for 56 years, I wondered, where did those bombs fall? I found out 56 years later. And the bomb bailout order came, and we found out later that the 3 men in the back of the plane had long gone. When they saw those engines burning, they just took off on their own. And they were imprisoned in a different place, of course. But
when you bail out, how do you get out of the plane?
the Bombay doors.
Okay, so you go out through the bottom.
Go out through the bottom, yeah. And of course, they went out through the waste windows. And It was interesting to me when it was going on. I was not at all scared, not one bit scared. Very determined, trying to think, well, what should we do now? What should we do next? Etc., etc. But absolutely no fear, which amazed me. Are you running out of tape?
Oh, we're good for another 10 minutes or so.
And so we bailed out. And I landed in a little mountain village where there weren't any highways, weren't any vehicles, just a real mountain village. And I landed in an open field, a lot of new snow. And I just stood there for a while. I watched some of my other officers being captured up there. And I kept looking around and finally decided, well, there's a big pine tree. And I'll go over to that pine tree and stand there so I won't be as visible as otherwise. But I skipped a rather significant thing. As you probably knew, the Germans would shoot people in their parachutes. And I decided I wouldn't go play that game. I would open my chute at the latest moment. And pretty soon I was falling, and my body was in a circle. My feet were on the outside, my head was in the middle, going round and around and around. And finally I decided, well, I think I had better pull my ripcord. So, and I had a chest chute, of course. So I pulled my ripcord, and I'm of course supine. I'm going around the circle like this, and the damn little pilot chute, the door sort of partly opened, but it didn't really open, and I thought, thank God, what am I going to do now? And it seemed like it was 2 or 3 minutes, but it was probably 2 or 3 seconds. And finally, I think I pulled on it a little bit, and away it went. And those chutes were big compared to the things they use today. I was told that my body was going 120 miles an hour. And when that chute opened, I thought it was going to tear me limb from limb, really. It was the force that was beyond your imagination. But it's okay. I got down to the ground very shortly.
Did they give you any practice with parachutes in training, or was this the first time you used a chute?
The first time I'd used a chute, yes, but the training they had was they had built a scaffold or a ladder platform up here, climb up the ladder, hook a rope onto your harness like it was a chute, and jump off, and when you get almost to the ground, you hit a bag of sand, something like that. I did that 2 or 3 times. That was the extent of training.
Okay.
And but the force was so great when the chute opened that it twisted the steel, the snaps, and so forth. And I had a deuce of a time getting that parachute loose. But I finally made it. And then, of course, the next thing was to get my harness off of my body. Same thing, the things were bent and twisted, but I made it. And then when I got to the pine tree, I put my May West and the parachute under that pine tree. And I stood there for quite a while, and this is about 1:30, 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And I decided, okay, there's some woods. I'll break for the woods because certainly they won't find me there, and I can figure out a little more of what I'm going to do. And I could see a farm over in the distance here. And I thought, well, if I have to, I can get into that barn tonight. A farm boy, I can milk some cows and get some milk, and maybe there's some corn there, I could eat some corn. And then I realized that it looks like there's a creek back here behind me. I could go down in the creek, walk in the creek, and they won't see my tracks. Then I thought, well, it's so damn cold, they'd probably freeze my feet, and that wouldn't work out very well. And so I decided I would just run down to the end of the woods and toward that farm, and there was a row of trees that I would have called a farm fence row. And I decided I'll go from tree to tree. But I could see buildings that, well, I didn't know what they were, but there were buildings, and there was nobody around. And I started down this fence row, and then I decided, no, I'm going across the field, over to the woods over there. And I got partway across, and I heard voices. And I just went down, belly down in the snow. And there was a bunch of women going like a bunch of geese down a path. And I thought, they're either going to see the wreckage of my plane, which I saw the plane go over a hill and crash. And I also saw a church, and I said, either they're going to church or they're going to look for the crash site. And I just laid there until their voices were not, I couldn't hear them anymore. And then I decided, well, I better get up and go. But I was laying on my stomach, remind that, and I looked back like this, and here's two young men coming down my tracks. They each had guns, rifles, but they were not soldiers. They were just local people, villagers. And I decided, well, we're not going to have a shootout, even though I had my 45, because that would be silly. So I just took my 45 out and I held it like that, you know, come and get it, you can have it. And they came on up, and of course, they didn't speak English, I didn't speak German. And they wanted me to get ahead of them and go over there. I said, I'm not getting ahead of you. If I do, you'll shoot me. You got your gun, I don't. So we continued. They said, okay, then you follow us. I mean, this is all motions. And I did follow them, and actually they went to the home of one of these two young men. I have pictures of it and so forth, and pictures of him. They took me in very kindly. I'd take my wet clothes off and dry them by the fireplace. Gave me some milk and bread and cheese. Again, no language barrier. And I took out my escape kit that everyone has that flies, and I pulled out the escape kit, and in there were some silk maps. And I took out the map of this area. I knew I was roughly here, and I was going to try to get them to show me. That didn't work at all. So I didn't know where I was. And anyway, eventually they had me put my clothes back on, took me to outdoors again. And I said, well, when are you going to shoot me? I mean, I just kept thinking that sooner or later it's going to happen. And they took me down to what was I'd call it a beer tavern. I have pictures of that too. And I'll tell you, that's very interesting. And all of the villagers came in to look at me, and they offered me cigarettes and beer. I took neither because I said, you're trying to feed me something that you can later question me, and I'll just tell you everything I know, so I'm not going to do that. Name, rank, and serial number. And after the villagers were satisfied, they had seen me, they said, okay, outdoors again. Now this time, some men from the village and the young men that caught me, all gun carriers, told me to go down that path. And I figured, well, they're going to get me far enough away from the village that the villagers won't know when they shoot me. And as I said, there were no roads, no vehicles. So we walked, and we walked, and we walked. And I thought we were going to walk forever and a day. And I noticed that there were some little kiosk type things along the path, and they all had biblical types of displays, and that helped me to be located later. But eventually, they got me into the town whose name I've forgotten. I have it, but I don't remember it. And they turned me over to the chief of police there.
Okay. At this point, this tape is just about out, so I'm going to pause right here. You can get up if you've been taken from the village where you first landed down to a larger town where you're brought to a police station.
Yeah.
Did you remember the name of the village that you fell into?
Sporbictal. Very small, be very hard to find it on a map. And I so wish I could recall the town where I was taken.
And was it was it in the Tyrol or kind of in between Graz and Switzerland, or do you?
Actually, it was, when all is said and done, it was probably less than a 3-hour walk from Sporbictal, and in the northwesterly direction.
Mm-hmm.
And the experience there at the police station, they took me up, and of course, here was my parachute and my Mae West and my harness dragging along behind me. And they tried to question me, and they spoke English,
Mm-hmm.
or at least some of them. And of course, I was name, rank, and serial number all the way through, and I thought, when are they going to get mad at me for that? And they didn't. On the Mae West, there was a little bag that contained a dye that was to color the water if you fell into the water. This Captain Poochmeyer got that and tried to get me to tell him what it was for. So I said, put it in some water. But his English wasn't very good, but it was good enough. So he put in some water, and I grabbed it, and I said, no, 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 no. And finally explained it. It goes in the water to help them find me if I fall in the water. And eventually, they got tired of what they were doing, and they motioned me to a cot to rest, which I did gratefully. And that didn't last very long, and they woke me up, and here were 2 German soldiers. So now I'm turned off over to the military, and sure as hell they're going to shoot me. And to make matters worse, they had skull and crossbones on their insignia. So I'm pretty sure this was it. And they took me down and put me in a half track in the back end of it, which was like the back end of a truck. And there was nothing there but a piece of canvas, just golden Billy hell. And I got on the bottom and I put that canvas around me, and we rode, and we rode. Every once in a while they'd stop and they'd mumble something to one another. There were 2 of them. And one would get out and be gone a little bit, and then he'd come back and mumble something. And that repeated time and time and time. Finally, they reached the point where they had me get out, and they put me on the sidecar of a motorcycle. But this same thing continued. Go, ask questions, go, ask questions. And what I later determined was that they were trying to find a cell to put me in. But at that time, they were shooting down so many of us that everything was full. And but they finally found one along about daylight, and they shepherded me in there and put me into a solitary cell, which was about 6 by 10 at the most. It just had a rack on it for a bed and a stool. And that was no surprise to me. That was about what I expected, and stayed overnight. No, I stayed. No, I'm mixed up now. I was able to lie down a couple of hours, and then it was breakfast time. They called me out for ersatz breakfast, and back in, and finally in the afternoon, they took me out of the cell and took me outdoors, and here's these two krauts in their half-track again. And so off we went in the half-track, and cold, oh, it was cold. And of course, riding on a piece of steel bouncing around is not a lot of fun. But we ended up then in Freistadt, which is a fairly big town for that area, and took me into the station, which was filled with prisoners. And there I met part of my crew. And now when the navigator jumped out of the plane, he did not have his flight suit on. He had his electric Blue Bunny suit. And you know what, the navigator works with a chronometer that's based in springs to protect it and so forth. Well, he had the chronometer with him. I still don't know how he got it there, and I had my hack watch. You know what hack means for a hack watch?
No.
Well, when you're on being briefed, getting ready for a mission, the last thing you do is the hack watch check. So everybody sits their watch a couple of minutes ahead or something, and then the one in charge does the countdown, 9, 10, hack, and then you push in the crystal or the stem so that your watches are all at the same time. So I had my hack watch, and I said to Gene, our navigator, I said, well, I'll give you my hack watch, and you give me the chronometer, and I got pockets, I can carry it, which he did. And then later in that afternoon, they took us outside, and something equivalent to the Red Cross gave us a cup of hot soup. I think it was pea soup, it was pea green, and that was good. And they gave us a loaf of Kriegsmark, each one. And of course, I had my flight suit, so I just put mine inside of my flight suit so I'd carry it. I don't know what the others did, but anyway, that was nice. And then later in the evening, they put us on passenger train, and the pilot, first pilot, navigator, and I were together. And we went into this one compartment where the two seats face each other. The guards were over here with their rifles, and the three of us were here, facing them. And of course, we were all exhausted, but you had to sit that way all night long, and with the cross rifles over here. And eventually we get to a big town in Germany, but it sounds like a hamburger or something. It was Hamburg.
Well, Hamburg.
No, it was Frankfurt.
Frankfurt, that makes more sense, yeah.
Yeah. We reached Frankfurt, and as we leave the train in formation, march down the street. I remember we went past a factory. What was the company that made the gunpowder and all of that? That was a big.
There was Krupp's or.
Yeah, I called it Krupp. Krupp. So that was the factory we walked past, and they put us in a building, a nondescript building, that had several rooms in it. And in my room, I would say there were 30 prisoners. And it was just a room, like in a barn. And later on, somebody opened the door and put in a bowl of soup, carrots, that's what it was. And somebody took it and that arm disappeared. There was a tablespoon in it. So we passed it around and each one of us took a tablespoonful of carrots. And that bowl had been used many times before and never been washed. You could tell that by the grime that was on the bowl. And so that was our dinner that night. And we just slept on the floor. Next morning, they took us to a building where they took our uniforms off, had us put on civilian clothes of their making. And they had a pile of airmen's boots, you know, the sheepskin lined boots. They had a pile that would go way up to the ceiling here of people that had been there ahead of us. And that type of thing, and the clothing was just laying all over our uniform clothing. And I said to myself, well, I know I'm not going to have enough food, so I'm going to tell them that I want pants that are too small for me. I think my waist then was maybe 36, I don't know. But anyway, I asked for 33s, and that's what I got. And so they gave us pants, shirt, socks, and a greatcoat, and a Red Cross package with underwear, socks, razor, and so forth. Then that was the place where they were going to question us some more. So they took us to solitary cells that each had about 8 or 10 people in it. And but one by one, they'd call us out for questioning. I remember one time they gave me a form to fill out. They said, this is a Red Cross form to get information that we can share with your family. And down at the bottom was, what group was you from? What kind of planes did you fly? What was your target? Red Cross information. So I gave them the information that was proper, and they didn't say anything about it. And then after that was all done, the next thing was to get on the freight train. They took us, I think they just marched us back to the terminal, or the train station. And as we were approaching the train station, local citizens were acting rather unfriendly. And the Germans stopped us, set up their machine guns until the people went away, and picked up our machine guns and on we went. And so I don't remember how many they're put in each boxcar, but whatever it was, we stayed in one end of the boxcar, sitting. They put a little straw on the floor, and we sat with our backs to the side, clear around this square, and you can imagine feet standing out here, and we would take turns bringing our feet to the top so the circulation would be all right, because they would be 3 deep in some places. And the German guards were at the other end, and in the middle was our pile of shoes. We had to take our shoes off. And once in a while they'd stop the train for a potty stop. They'd let us get our shoes on again, get outdoors and do whatever, back on the train, and away we go. We were concerned because there was no marking on that train, which would have been a target for anybody that was up there. But we made it through. 5 nights and 4 days of hell riding and never knowing what's ahead. But we ended up at that time at Barth, Germany. And we were marched from the train station to the camp, Stalag Luft 1. At that time, Stalag Luft 1 was the south camp, and the West Camp, I guess they called it. I called it the North Camp myself. And I and my pilot and others, of course, other prisoners, were put into barracks that used to be a German youth barracks. And they were pretty well worn out. The buildings were very shabby condition. But we did have a mess hall, and I didn't tell you that our operations officer of 454th Group, on that particular day that we flew, he said, "I'm going to fly with you today in your co-pilot seat," which he did. So he was captured too. And he ended up in the compound I was in. And since we had a mess hall, he was put in charge of the mess hall because his family had a restaurant business. And sometime later, that building burned to the ground. I don't know. I never knew why. And the main food they gave us was barley, which is sort of like oatmeal. And the difference is it has worms floating around on the top of it. I decided, well, the worm is eating what they're feeding me, and he's okay, so I might as well eat the same stuff. And the worm, which I did. But I had a roommate, Doc Gillespie, who just could not anyhow eat that stuff. So he gave me his serving. So I had 2 servings of oatmeal and worms. And as I said, that was the most prominent food we had. Sometimes we'd have a potato. We usually had Kriegsbrot, which was made partly of sawdust, as you probably know. And sometimes they'd have a little sauerkraut, usually with shards of glass in it. And one time we had some meat of some kind. They called it meat anyway. It was in a strip like salami or something. I don't know what it was, probably horse meat. And but we did all kinds of things to entertain ourselves. I remember I was studying accounting in the business school before I went in, and there was a man there that was able to lead a course in accounting, and we studied that. And we had Bibles eventually, and we had Sunday school. We put on plays, musicals, did quite a few things. One of the things that bothered me was some of the guys started playing poker. Now, we all knew that our pay was piling up. Mm-hmm. And these guys playing poker were using IOUs, which is not a good way to play poker. And some of them ended up in debt, thousands of dollars. I've often wondered if they ever got their collection. But anyway, that was that. And I noticed that after I was there, periodically more prisoners would come in. And in a couple of weeks, usually, there would be some suicides from that new group. And that happened repeatedly. And I wondered why, what's happening to those guys? And the only thing I could conclude was that they, for some reason, didn't have faith that they were going to get through this somehow. But that was very noticeable. We eventually got some Red Cross food parcels. We were supposed to get 1 parcel per week. We got 1 parcel now and then. The Germans would make us punch a hole in the tin cans that had maybe jelly in them or something like that. Whatever was in a tin can had to be punched so that we couldn't save it, accumulate it for an escape trip or something like that. And that without those food parcels, we wouldn't be having this little discussion today. And the Germans liked this stuff too. We traded, we established a currency, which was cigarettes. Interestingly, I didn't smoke until then. Just before I went overseas, I started smoking a pipe. And eventually, and I mean eventually, I got a letter from my wife. It took a long, long time. And she told me that the American Tobacco Company had called her and said if she would give them my address, they would see that I had tobacco products. Well, I think most everybody did that because the cigarettes came in more regularly than food. And so we established a currency over cigarettes. And we set up a store because some packages would have something that people didn't want and so forth.
Now, would you trade things with the Germans too?
Oh, a little bit, a little bit. Schultz. Some of them were receptive to helping us with little things for a favor of a bar of soap or something like that. Lots of attempts to escape. We noticed that if they dug a tunnel and came up, there were the German guards and the police dogs waiting for them. So somebody among us was not friendly. And I decided that among these, well, let me back up a little bit. When we got to Stalag 1, North Compound, the commandant there was a Luftwaffe pilot who had been injured and was recuperating and put in charge of the Stalag. He had lived in the same house in New York City that some of our people had lived in. And they compared notes about knotholes and so forth. It had to be true. And of course he spoke excellent English. And he was a pretty decent guy, pretty decent. And every so often they would change commandants, so that nice thing didn't last. I was shot at one time. As time went on, we established a library of books sent over from England and other books in one building, in one room, in one building. Now, it was known that when the siren sounds, that means there's a possible air attack. Get in your rooms, shut the shutter, shut the door, and wait till all free. When I was at the library, the siren sounded to say air attack. I thought I heard the all clear. The building was next to my building, but it was about 40 yards away. So I got out of the building in which the library is located, and I start for my building, and I hear some German guttural language, and then I hear a shot. And I hear the bullet hit right by my foot. And did I ever run? It didn't take me long to get from there into my barrack. And but that's the only time I was ever shot at.
Now, in the camp itself, were all of the prisoners American airmen, or were there British there, or?
98% were American officers.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but there were some British.
And they kept the officers and enlisted men separately?
Yes, there were no enlisted men. Well, enough enlisted men to do the grunt work, to get the coal, get the Kriegsbrot, to get the potatoes when they had them, and so forth. Yes, and but not very many. None of our crew was there. I could take more time than you want to talk about being a prisoner. And the main thing was it was just so uncertain, and the time just dragged and dragged, and you just wondered, how long is this going on? But we had a radio. I don't know where it came from. Never saw it. But we did have a prisoner who had been a pressman, Lowell Thomas. Lowell Thomas?
He was a correspondent. He wasn't a prisoner, but...
That's right. And he wrote a book about parachute to Berlin because he flew out of England in a night flight that the Germans always used night flights, you know, nighttime bombing, and we didn't. And he was shot down that night, became a prisoner, and escaped 2 or 3 times from them, but he ended up in Stalag-Luftwand. I wondered if he was probably our newsman, but I don't know. The Germans tried ever so many times to find that radio. They never found it. But we had a newspaper that would be printed up each day. 1 typewriter type paper with quick news clips. 1 person in each room assigned for the newsman. He would get that paper, read it from room to room, and then burn it. And so we kept track, and along in the later few months, when we knew the Battle of the Bulge was over and so forth, we knew we were going to make it sometime. We put up a big war map on the outside of the barracks, and the Germans would come over there and check on where the war was going on in the war.
Now, where did you have the radio hidden?
I don't know. I don't know.
Because I remember there was, in one of the camps, there was a radio that was actually hidden, and it was underneath the commandant's headquarters or something like that.
Yeah.
So that if they're doing detectors or things, you confuse it with your own. But you just knew that there was one, and that was the source of the news that you were getting.
That's right. And that, of course, was very helpful to have that. At night, well, I'll show you some pictures after we get through here. We became rather inventive, and people like alcohol, some people do. And most of our food parcels contained prunes. So those people started making prune brew. The damn fools at one time, they put it up over the ceiling to brew, and it overflowed and flowed down into the room. Let me see. Ask me a question.
Okay. In general, how would you describe or characterize the guards in the camp? How old were they? How did they treat you?
Almost to a man, they were old people who weren't capable of doing anything else. And one of them had worked in a butcher shop in Brooklyn, and some of our prisoners went past his shop night and day going to and from school. Now, he was one of the ones that you could deal with. I think really we were very fortunate compared to what some people went through. Now, some of my crew members, the enlisted, were on that horrible march in the wintertime with terrible, unbearable conditions, just unbearable.
Yeah. When the Russians got close, they marched away and they kept get moving around.
Yeah, and our camp was such in the middle that they would bring prisoners into our camp instead of taking us out. And they, in fact, a couple of times they marched us outside of the camp and took us to a stream where we could take off our clothes and swim, so to speak. And there we could see in the far distance was a haystack where German women soldiers were sunning. But it was distant. And sometimes they would march these women up and down the street outside of our camp just to make us feel badly. When the war ended, and we were in charge, well, let me back up again. During the time we were there, we would see trucks going by loaded with people in the back in striped suits, prisoners.
Right.
And of course they were taking them to work somewhere. And they were taking them to work in the aircraft plant that was right beside the prison. And it was a training camp also. When the war was ended, I didn't see it, people got into that area and they lived in caves, and there would be corpses sitting at a table where they died. And that was those people that were going back and forth in the.
Now, did the attitude of the German guards or whatever change in the later stages of the war as the Russians were getting closer? And
Their general demeanor depended upon how the war was going, day by day, week by week, or whatever. If they were winning, they'd be nasty. If they were losing, they'd be kind. It was, you could just read it like a book. And then came the time when the Russians were really getting close. We could hear the big guns when they went off. And I got this really from a story that's in a magazine I have that tells specifically about this capture or this liberation by the Russian army, etc., and the negotiations that went on between the American top officers. We had a lot of aces, in fact, in our camp, and the Russians. But the Germans came. The German commandant went to our officer, our lead officer, wanted to make a deal. Says, let's take all of those prisoners and let's march west. And our officer said, no way. We're not going to be a bunch of people marching anywhere to be shot, misunderstood, mistaken by our forces. And that stuck. So the German commandant said, let me become your prisoner. No, thank you, we don't want that either. And so one night, it was a very kind of ghostly night, we could hear voices. And there was, not far from my barrack was a hard surface road. And something was going on. And next morning, all of the Germans were gone. And I guess in a day or so, the Russians came in. And they were terrible. They were nice, okay to us. But we could hear, we were only, it was a big, big field, and then there was the city of Barth. And we could hear screams, and we could hear gunshots, and they were in just ravishing the town. And but they came in and organized a thing and tore all of the barbed wire down from our place, and went out, pillaged the countryside, killed some cattle, and brought in some fresh beef and like that. So we had the best food we'd had since we'd been in the prison camp. And then it took about 2 weeks of negotiation with the Russians before they would let the American planes come in, this airport right beside us. They came in and they had it so well organized, and we were well advised. We each had our little bag, our little package that was our belongings. We'd go out to the airport in groups, so many for each plane. The planes came in and they were on the ground 5 minutes, and away they went. That just took us out to Camp Lucky Strike eventually. And that was an experience in itself. That was the biggest tent city I think there ever was in the world, and the worst weather there ever was in the world. I remember the day that General Eisenhower came in and he got up on one, there was a picnic table outside not far from my tent. He climbed up on that, stood up on that picnic table, and he said, I understand you're getting anxious to get out of this place, but there doesn't seem to be anybody coming. And he says, well, I'll tell you, we'll get those goddamn ships in here and you're going to be able to go home. And that didn't happen very fast, but it happened. And I wouldn't leave the camp because I wanted to get on that first ship home. Well, some of the guys went to Paris and raised hell, but not I. And Doc Gillespie, who couldn't eat worms, also stayed with camp. And
So he managed to survive without
yes.
having eaten the barley. There was enough other food that he
yeah,
managed.
as I said, if we hadn't had the International Red Cross, we wouldn't have survived. But we were very, very fortunate. We were fortunate that the camp wasn't bombed. One day we saw, and this was when we were outdoors and we didn't have the blinds or the shutters on our rooms and so on, we saw, well, that's American B-24s out there. And they made a little circle and they came right over the camp, and I could see that the bomb bay doors were open. I thought, what the hell is the matter with those guys? Don't they know what they're doing? Well, they just flew on over. I think for some reason they recognized the barbed wire fences or something. But for a minute it looked like they were going to heck out of this.
So you were.
Then I could, as I said, the story about being a prisoner is another story which you don't have time for. But we got through it safely. Cold, oh mercy, in the winter time it was cold. We slept with all of the clothing we had and our greatcoats. And we did have a blanket, but we put on our boots, shoes, socks, and everything in order to keep warm at night. And we would get a coal ration. The coal was pressed coal. It was pressed into bricks. I think it was coal dust that had been pressed. I'm not sure, but anyway, we'd get a certain count of those coal bricks, but it wasn't enough in any way to warm the room. So we would save it, and when we wanted some hot water, maybe to make some soup or something like that, we would put a couple of coal blocks up and get them started, and put the water in there and get it hot, and that was about the extent of that. And sometimes I wonder really how we survived all of that and kept our minds, but we did. Most of us did.
Well, you were young, you were in pretty good shape going in. You had some idea that you had some chance of getting out of there, and after a while maybe it didn't look like the Germans were terribly interested in killing you, so...
Periodically would get the rumor from the guards that Hitler wants all Air Force officers shot. We got that more than once. It doesn't make you feel real good, but you know it's possible. You know that guy was possible to do anything. And my wife didn't know what happened to me. She knew I was MIA. This was, remember, February 25, 1944. It was about May 17 when she began to get letters from people along the East Coast who were ham radio operators, and they had picked up messages from the Red Cross and from the Germans, the names of people that were in prison. And so that's how she found out about middle of May. So it was a good big 3 months that she just knew I was missing. And the other strange part of it was, as I mentioned earlier, her father was the Western Union operator. He took to her the messages that said I was MIA. And she was living at home with him in this little town, and he did all of those messages. And of course everybody knew everybody in that little town. So.
And a lot of those telegrams were telling people that someone had been killed.
Yeah, yes. And I have copies of all of those telegrams, and I have a copy of a book that was put together by my roommate over there, a guy named Harold Cook. He was, I don't know, he was either bombardier or navigator. And he had drawn pictures of things in my room, pictures of my trunk, my bunk, and all of the bunks in the room, and put together a nice booklet, which I'll show you later. And I didn't know he had done that, but it's unbelievable because, now let's talk again about the chronometer. When I got into the room and we were around there a bit and we kind of got acquainted with things, I realized that a lot of guys didn't have their watches. They were taken away by the Germans. But I had my chronometer.
Now, how would you manage to keep that?
I
They
hid
make
it. I hid it.
But
Well, sometimes I'd hang it around my neck, sometimes hang it around my belt. Sometimes I'd put it in a little can of tobacco that I had. And whenever the Germans were going to search us, I would hide it in the room. Anyway, I got along with it, got through with it. So people could come in and say what time it was. The day the Germans liberated us, the watch stopped. And it sits over there in the corner right now. And that's something. That is something.
now, you taken your story to the point where you were back at Lucky Strike, it's summer of '45 by then, you're waiting to go home. How long do you think you spent in the camp waiting for a boat?
I wish I'd really kept track of the time, but it was the middle of January, or middle of June rather. It would have been about 3 weeks.
Okay. And then what kind of boat did you go on?
We were on a ship that was on its maiden voyage called the Admiral Mail. And there were 3,000 of us on that ship, which was a lot better than what a lot of people had. They had Liberty ships and the like of that. So we were very fortunate in that way. But one of the things that is embedded in my mind as we were pulling out of the port on the Admiral Mail to see that town, the Havre, and the destruction, just utter destruction. Now, I spent my time in the prison camp. I hadn't seen war to speak of. Just to see those bathtubs hanging out there on the third floor and things like that, and piles of bricks, and what damage was done. But I guess it was all for the right cause. But you wonder, why can't people live together in peace? But they never will. I don't think they ever will. And you think of the people over in the desert, so they have no value on life, seems to me. It's kind of discouraging. You think that we went over there to save the country, and now we're back trying to save somebody else.
And part of the point of this whole project is to make people recognize and realize what it means to get into a war and what happens when you do that. And it's by having this kind of story that message gets across, certainly. Now for yourself, though, at this point in time, you know, you've gotten through all of that. They get you up on the ship. Was the weather decent on the way across?
Terrible.
Okay.
Terrible. I had great trouble. I'd go to sick bay each day, get another box of aspirin to get me through till the next day I could get another box of aspirin. And sometime I felt like, oh, I'd like to just pound my head on that steel floor because of the, everybody has it, what is it? Sinus, sinusitis. Oh, I was absolutely miserable on the entire trip. And we came into Boston, and I thought, here the Red Cross is going to meet us. We're going to have hot cocoa and donuts and stuff. Wasn't anybody there at all. Nobody met us. They just took us off the ship, put us on a train, and sent us to an army camp by Fort Dix. Is that in New Jersey?
New Jersey's Fort Dix, yes.
We landed in Boston.
And there's Fort Devens was outside of Boston, and Dix was down by New York.
I don't know which one it was.
Okay.
It seems like it was Fort Dix.
Okay.
We took a train ride. And, but it said no hot chocolate, no donuts, no bands, no anything. But we did go past, no, we didn't either. It was later that I saw the Statue of Liberty. So here I am now, and I had ruined my back. I've had about 7, 8 spinal surgeries. Had both hips replaced. And now at this point, and I think it's all related to the things I went through. I also have high potassium, which is a terrible situation to have, because all of the things that are good you can't eat. Most people have low potassium when they get to my age. I have high potassium. And I found out about that in a strange way. When we were living in Florida, I went to the Veterans Association to have my yearly health checkup. And the situation was you would go down in my case, one Monday, have the blood drawn and the urine taken, go back the next Monday, and the doctor would have those results, and then he would do the examination and so forth. So I went down Monday, and they did the lab stuff, and that night when we were just sitting down for dinner, the phone rang. It was a nurse from Gainesville. We were in the Leesburg area. She said, as soon as she established that I was the person she wanted to talk to, she said, and these are her words, "You get yourself immediately to the nearest emergency service. You have a condition that could be fatal." Just out of the blue. I didn't know there was anything wrong with me. So I did, and fortunately we had a nice, beautiful hospital there in the village. It was brand new. And they did it, and they gave me some food or something to take that was supposed to absorb the potassium. So I went back the following Monday then to have my physical. They said, well, since you had a little problem with that blood sample, we've got to do that over again. That's what they did. And the doctor did his physical on me and so forth. And that night, again, we're sitting down to dinner, the phone rings. This time it's the doctor from Gainesville. Same message, word for word. Get yourself to the nearest emergency facility. And this time I didn't do it. But I did get signed up with a doctor. She was the, what was her specialty? Anyway, she found out what the problem was and told me how to live with the condition. And it's sort of like any food that's good I can't eat, and if it isn't good I can. But I can't have citrus, I can't have melons, I can't have potatoes and dark bread and all of that type of thing. I shouldn't eat beef, and well, the list goes on and on. But I can eat green beans. I can eat green beans. But it keeps me out of the fibrillation, I guess they call it, that could be fatal.
Okay. There were the back injuries and that stuff. Was that out of the parachute jump or the landing or?
Yeah, the parachute jump. When the chute opened.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I did that much to you.
Yeah, the government, the Veterans Administration has rated me totally, permanently disabled, unemployable due to military action.
Okay. So when you actually then, you got back to the States, you muster out, they send you home. You get back, what did you do once you got back home?
Well, the first thing they did was to send us down. They gave me 60 days, I think, during which time, or maybe it was after we came back from Miami Beach. We went down to Miami Beach for getting our records up to date,
Right.
paying our income tax and all of that stuff. And then came back, and I guess we're on 60-day leave. I don't remember just all of those details, but I decided that I wanted to continue my education in business and accounting and so forth. And there was a school supposedly had a good reputation in Ypsilanti, Cleary Business College. And so I contacted them and they said, oh yes, we'd be happy to have you as a student. So my wife and I got in her father's car, which could not at that time be driven more than 45 miles an hour because of the war, you know, and you don't replace cars. And you have to be sure and stop and put some oil in. So we drove up to Ypsilanti, and I was very disappointed there. The school did not look well. The physical plant didn't look well. In fact, one room I was in, the wallpaper was hanging down and sagging, and I said to the dean, or whatever they call him, I said, well, what about living situations around here? He said, it's rather tight, but we're sending people out to Willow Run Village. They can find places out there. So we went out and looked at Willow Run Village, and we decided, well, let's just head on for home, and we'll stop somewhere and phone Cleary College to tell them we've changed our minds, which we did. And then my wife, bless her, she says, we're going right past the University of Michigan. Why don't you go in there and see if you can get in there? Lo and behold, I did, and I did. So on January, the following January, thousands and millions of other veterans started at the University of Michigan, where several temporary classrooms, because the veterans had just flooded in there, and in fact we ended up living at Willow Run Village, and the university ran a bus back and forth, and I don't know if you've ever seen those buildings or not, probably not, but they stood on stilts, all of them. And they were about as big as this room, if it went all the way through, with coal-burning stoves and pipes, water pipes running through the coal-burning stove to give you hot water. And you talk to your neighbors through the wall, and just enough room to live, and that's all, nothing more.
How long did you stay there?
Until the university finished some new apartments in town, right near the university hospital. And that was heaven, I tell you. Brand new brick buildings, new furniture, and that was a long ways for me to walk to the business college, though. But that's what I did. And graduated in 1949. Started work at the Upjohn Company before I graduated. Actually, I started work there February 1. My graduation was February 5. And I worked there for 35 years and got the Upjohn Award, and then retired more than 25 years ago.
All right. Now, if you look back across this whole thing now, and that combination of the whole extended training and shipping over, and then that experience of being shot down, captured, and living in the camp, what kind of effect would you say that had on you overall, or can you even begin to measure it?
That brought me closer to God, definitely. Because, as I said, I felt that God was with me in that plane. And as I said, I had no fear. I just wanted to be sure I did the right thing for the circumstance, whatever it was. And that's about it.
Did you feel like, when you got home and you were back there, did you feel like you were in a lot of ways the same person you were when you left, or were there adjustment issues from getting back to the real world?
No. It's hard to explain. Firstly, I think I did have a greater appreciation for my faith, and I got home to, like, my wife waited for me, and some wives didn't.
Yeah.
And the family was fine and all of that, but I still was incomplete. I had to get this college education and sometime have a family. And I think it also taught me to be persistent and, last it out, whatever it is, and get it done, stick with it. There were times really when I didn't want to finish the university. It was difficult. I didn't graduate as valedictorian, but I graduated.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm glad I did. Very, very fortunate, but sometimes I am bothered now by people who have no appreciation for the blessings they have by living in this country. They just don't get it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think because of that, someday they're going to regret it, one way or another. I don't like to be political, but I'm deeply concerned with where we are right now. I think the president is not qualified for the job, and I think he's making some foolish mistakes that are because he's not qualified. He's not experienced enough, and I wonder, why has he locked off all of his personal records about his college records and so forth? Why has he said those are not available to the public? And they seem to be adhering to that. Now, I have to wonder, is that because of his choices of subjects and so forth? Is it mostly that he's been learning how to be a good socialist? I don't know, but sometimes he acts like it, and that's not good, if that's what's true. And that's not the kind of world I fought for, not at all.
All right.
And that would be a great disappointment if that's where he's trying to take us, and it looks like he is.
Well, that's one that people looking at this interview 50 years from now will be able to answer the question of.
Mm-hmm.
In the meantime, those of us here right now will just kind of probably have to wait and see.
Mm-hmm.
But in the meantime, I'd like to thank you very much for taking the time to talk to me today. It's a remarkable story, and you tell it well.
Well, I hope so. I do hope so, and I hope it'll be of some benefit and some interest to somebody sometime, somewhere. And now that that is over, I'd like to show you a couple of pieces,
Very good.
if you have the
Okay.
time.
Yeah, I like to see them.